With chapter 13, we get a new foil for Darcy, somebody else against whom Elizabeth and consequently the reader can see Darcy as opposed to in personality. The character in question here in chapter 13 is also one of the best, I think, Jane Austen comic characters, Mr. Collins. And Mr. Collins is the cousin of Mr. Bennet. So he is a cousin, I think, once removed, perhaps, from Elizabeth. He's related to the girls, the Bennet family. And he, in the will of the family, is due to inherit the house when Mr. Bennet dies. And so Mrs. Bennet is already displeased to hear about him. And Mr. Bennet, when he receives a letter here from Mr. Collins at the opening of chapter 13, is amused by his cousin because he sees him as a buffoon, an idiot, a fool, which he is, of course. But nevertheless, Mr. Bennet doesn't see there's any kind of danger from Mr. Collins. And he says here at the opening of 13 that the letter is from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who when I am dead may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. So Mr. Bennet, in his cynical, whimsical way, doesn't see any necessary danger in what Mr. Collins poses to the family. Jane Austen frequently brings up the letter as a vehicle for revealing certain things, showing the character of a person, and we get a sense of what type of man Collins is by the way that he writes. Notice in the letter the number of passages that reveal aspects of his character. He says here in the letter, I have been so fortunate as to be distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, widow of Sir Louis de Bourgh, whose bounty and beneficence has preferred me to the valuable rectory of this parish, where it shall be my earnest endeavour to demean myself with grateful respect towards her ladyship, and be ever ready to perform those rites and ceremonies which are instituted by the Church of England. Now, whenever we look at a character, we can know a character by various things that are revealed in the text. We can know them by how they look, how they appear, what they do, what they say, or how they say a thing. We can also learn them by the words of other people about them. We can learn about them by details of either clothing they wear or references to them that the author might give us. But here, from this little passage, the very words of Collins himself, we learn a few things about him that begin to shape the vision of what this type of man is. He says, I am so fortunate as to be distinguished for the patronage of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Well, immediately Lady Catherine de Bourgh is brought into the picture, and she remains a major character throughout the rest of the text. But Collins, notice, is very beholden to her, so much so that he's constantly praising her and saying how great she is. He's on her payroll and receiving a fat check, basically, from her on a regular basis. Consequently, he's a man who is, to some degree, compromised. He finds it necessary to praise her constantly. But he also is a man who seems to know which side his bread is buttered on. He is very willing to make himself groveling before anybody who is going to give him money or fame or promotion. And that's why he says things like, it shall be my earnest endeavor to demean myself. And the very nature of words, the very way that he puts things, also reveals something about his character. He says, I will perform those rites and ceremonies which are instituted by the Church of England. That's not the sound of somebody who is actually in love with the church. The words themselves are not the sound of somebody who is desirous to do what's right or desirous to do what God asks him to do. This is rather the sign of somebody who is obsequious. He is somebody who is wanting to do everything that's proper and right, but doesn't really have any zeal for the Church of England or for the church or for God or for anything holy. Further on in the letter he says, I cannot be otherwise than concerned at being the means of injuring your amiable daughters, and beg leave to apologize for it, as well as to assure you of my readiness to make them every possible amends, but of this hereafter. Again, Collins is a type of man who apologizes constantly for everything. He is very groveling in all of his mannerisms. He's what you might want to say is a toady. The word is somebody who is just always putting himself as like a footstool for other people. And William Collins then is portrayed as somebody who is not very pleasant to be around. He's rather dull and boring. He's also somebody who is constantly trying to say what's right, rather than simply speaking his mind or simply being honest or simply thinking deeply about subjects. Well, when we get to the description of Collins himself, the appearance of the man tells us something about him as well, and this is also in 13 further on. It says that he was punctual, of course, he was right on time, and Mr. Bennet answers the door and finds him, and it says that he was a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25. His air was grave and stately, and his manners were very formal. He had not been long seated before he complimented Mrs. Bennet on having so fine a family of daughters, said he had heard much of their beauty, and that in this instance fame had fallen short of the truth, and added that he did not doubt her seeing them all in due time disposed of in marriage. The very description of the man, 25-year-old guy, is as tall and heavy-looking. He is big. He fills a space. He is heavy-looking. He seems almost like he's weighing down on the earth. But more than that, he is also grave and stately, it says, and his manners are very formal. Now, if you're very perceptive here, you'll notice that this is immediately a reference to Mr. Darcy. Darcy himself is a man who is grave and stately, and his manners seem very formal, almost overly much so. But this is a parody of Darcy. Collins is a trope of Darcy. He's parodying the character of Darcy. And Jane Austen sets it up so that we automatically think of Darcy when we see Collins. But Collins is a comic version of Darcy. And just as Darcy is related to wealth and finance, Collins is related to wealth and finance. He is going to be taking over the house from the Bennets when Mr. Bennet dies. And just as Mr. Collins is beholden to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Mr. Darcy is also to some degree beholden to Lady Catherine as well. We find out later on that Lady Catherine is his aunt, is Darcy's aunt. And so there is a relationship between Darcy and Catherine, just as there's a relationship between Collins and Catherine de Bourgh. Mr. Collins then also compliments the daughters on their beauty. We find it hard to understand what this implies, but in this society, in Jane Austen's society, to say such things would be rude. It would be something you don't talk about. You don't come into someone's home and say, oh, you have lovely daughters. It would be insulting. It would be something which you wouldn't say in public. And so Collins, in trying to be stately and impressive, ends up being something of a clod. He is a man who is overly concerned with saying what's right and doing what's right. And consequently, he comes off as being something of a bore. That same boorishness appears at the end of dinner when, after Collins has come to visit, they have dinner, and Mr. Collins compliments them on the daughters being able to cook so well. Mrs. Bennet says, the dinner, too, in its turn was highly admired, and he begged to know to which of his fair cousins the excellency of its cooking was owing. But he was set right there by Mrs. Bennet, who assured him with some asperity that they were very well able to keep a good cook, and that her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. He begged pardon for having displeased her. In a softened tone, she declared herself not at all offended. But he continued to apologize for about a quarter of an hour. Even though Mrs. Bennet says, I wasn't really offended, Collins nevertheless falls all over himself in apologizing. Again, an obsequiousness, which is over the top. He is so trying to grovel and make himself in the good graces of everybody that he ends up being very boring. None of this boringness or cloddishness is lost on Mr. Bennet. And here we get a little insight into Mr. Bennet again. Remember that Mr. Bennet is somebody who's very aloof. He's the character who embodies pride. As we heard earlier, pride is that standoffishness, thinking you're above everybody else in the whole human experience. Mr. Bennet just sees this all as humorous. And when we turn to chapter 14, Mr. Bennet is actually somewhat laughing at Collins the entire time. And it says here, Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance, and except in an occasional glance at Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. Here Mr. Bennet, who is very intelligent, very keen, even if he is very proud, is seeing Collins as a joke. Collins is humorous. He's funny to Mr. Bennet. And consequently, Mr. Bennet is laughing the whole time at him, even though Collins doesn't get the joke. Further on in the text, it says this, By tea-time, however, the dose had been enough, and Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest into the drawing-room again, and when tea was over, glad to invite him to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced. But on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, he started back and, begging pardon, protested that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation, he chose Fordyce's Sermons. When we look at character again, the actions of the character define the person. And here Collins is asked to read to the ladies, which he's very glad to do. He's very boring when he reads. But when things are produced, would you like to read this exciting novel or that exciting novel? He has a visible reaction. He starts back, oh, I never read novels. Well, Collins objects to literature. I never read that. But he will read them, Fordyce's Sermons. Now, if you go and look up Fordyce's Sermons, which I urge you to do, it's readily available, it is a very boring text. It's a text of basically aphorisms and sayings and advice to young ladies to improve themselves morally so they become much more holy and religious. And it is some of the most boring reading you could do. It's almost humorous. I would strongly encourage you to go and read it. Fordyce's Sermons is what Collins chooses from the library of Mr. Bennet. And consequently, he sets all of the household on edge because nobody wants to hear this lecturing and this forcing them to be holy and all this. Not only does he choose Fordyce's Sermons, but then the text says that he reads it in a very monotonous solemnity. He's dull. He's boring. This fellow would basically put the snuffer on any party. He's the sort of man who thinks that he is so pious and so pompous and so holy that he ends up boring everybody else in the room, sucking the oxygen out of the room, I think we say. Well, further on in the text, the author herself weighs in to comment on Mr. Collins. And if you notice the subtlety of Jane Austen, she doesn't immediately make comments directly about Mr. Collins. She's just reporting the facts, so to speak. But by the time we get to chapter 15, she actually judges him herself. We see at the opening of 15 that she says, Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by education or society. Further on in that same text, she points out that, having now a good house and a very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters, if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by common report. So first off, Jane Austen says that Collins is not very sensible. He's not a sensible man. He's a fool. He's kind of an idiot. Not only is he by nature an idiot, but he's not been very well educated. And so he has had no access to any kind of thought or any self-reflection. He is a man who is completely inside his own little world, his own little box of thinking. Well, that's the very heart of the thesis of Jane Austen's work. That people in the community are trapped within a box of their own making, a mental box of their own making. And the whole movement of the work is to move out of that box to enlightenment so that you are thinking critically about your own life and the world around you. Mr. Collins doesn't do that. His main problem is that he doesn't think critically about himself. He thinks that he's God's gift to humanity. And in this instance, he's God's gift to women. He's come like an angel of God to rescue them from their poverty, and by an offer of marriage, raise up one of the daughters to the excellence of being under the patronage of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. What arrogance! I mean, if, for instance, someone were to be offered this, you'd think that they'd be out of their mind to accept such an offer. And yet Collins thinks that he's doing the family a favor. And he sets his sights particularly on the eldest, because that would make sense. The eldest should be the one he chooses. It says here in the text, his plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views and established all his strictest notions of what was due to seniority, and for the first evening she was his settled choice. So when Collins comes to Longbourn, he intends to get a wife. The wife he chooses is Jane, the eldest, Miss Bennet. In Jane Austen's time, the eldest daughter would be named Miss Bennet or referred to as Miss Bennet. The other daughters after that would be Miss Elizabeth, Miss Mary, Miss Kitty, Miss Lydia, and so on and so forth. But the eldest would be Miss Bennet. So in reference here, Miss Bennet's lovely face, that means Jane. So Collins comes in intentionally to get a wife, and he sets his sights specifically on the eldest daughter. But Mrs. Bennet, thinking that Jane is going to be wed to Bingley, says, no. she's already spoken for. There's going to be a marriage very soon. And so Collins backs off. And Mrs. Bennet, not wanting to lose Mr. Collins' possible marriage to her daughter, says, why not Elizabeth? Think of Elizabeth. And Collins thinks, a very suitable substitute. And so he shifts his view from Jane to Elizabeth. There's no love here, see. There's no desire at all. There's no passion. It's simply a contract. Well, further on, we find Collins again being foolish and idiotic when they go into town. But there's another character introduced here at the end of the chapter which we just have to touch on briefly, and that's Mr. Wickham. Wickham is yet again a foil for Darcy, and he is young and dashing and charming. He's a bit like a Mr. Bingley character. We find him at the end of the chapter here, and it says, Mr. Denny introduced them directly and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town. And he was happy to say had accepted a commission in their corps. This is exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. His appearance was greatly in his favor. He had all the best part of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and very pleasing address. When Elizabeth and the other girls are introduced to Mr. Denny, who's a soldier, and then introduced Denny's friend, Mr. Wickham, we notice that they immediately see he's a very handsome young man. In fact, he's stunningly good-looking. Not only that, but Mr. Wickham is a man who's very charming in his address. He speaks well, he looks well. As soon as he gets dressed in his regimentals, he will be perfect in every way, which is said with a bit of irony, because we don't know anything about the character of Wickham yet. We only know the superficial, the face value. He is a good-looking young man who speaks well and compliments everybody. Wickham, though, has a dark past, and we find this out further on. But it's hinted at when we see him contrasted with Darcy at the end of the chapter. Mr. Darcy, who we've seen so far to be revealed as very proud, but also very intelligent, very critical, very honest, sees Mr. Wickham and immediately has a visceral reaction. It says here, Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger. And Elizabeth, happening to see the countenance of both as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Both changed color. One looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return. What could be the meaning of it? When the two men see each other, it's obvious that there's an antipathy between them. They don't like each other. One turns red, the other white. We can conjecture which one turns red and which one's white, but I would suspect that the redness is Darcy and the white is Wickham. The Wickham is drained of blood. I didn't expect to see that man here. And Darcy flushes with anger at seeing Wickham. It could go the other way, but I suspect it's probably that way. Whatever the case, Darcy is immediately set in contrast to Wickham. And when we see Mr. Wickham's character, although attractive to the women, is obviously antithetical to Mr. Darcy. They are opposed to each other. And if we see Darcy as an honorable, noble character, then Wickham is going to be seen as the opposite. This sort of juxtaposition of two characters is what Jane Austen does throughout the work. She makes constant foils between one character and the next. The foil reveals something about the principal character. And here Wickham is revealing something about Darcy. Whatever the past issue is between the two men, it is something which makes them completely opposed to each other. So here in this chapter we've had two foils to Mr. Darcy. We've had Mr. Collins, who is something of a foolish version of Mr. Darcy. And we've had Mr. Wickham, who is something of the nemesis of Mr. Darcy. And with that, Jane Austen develops the character of Darcy, but also develops the worldview of Elizabeth. Elizabeth beginning to see different people as possible or potential marriage partners in the future. Darcy's vision of Elizabeth is colored too, because he sees her now associating with Wickham and thinks, perhaps she is not as good as I thought she was. And so there's a slight change in his opinion as well.